Hon Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a privilege to be called to speak immediately after two important speeches from each of the front benches. Mr. Speaker, I campaigned in favour of Britain remaining a member in 1975. I was too young to vote, but I did put leaflets through doors because those leaflets said very clearly that we would remain a member of a common market of independent trading states and that nothing about our membership would in any way affect the sovereignty of this Parliament, of which I am proud to be a member. Unfortunately, in the 40 years since that referendum took place, we have moved steadily away from that vision, with more and more power given over to Brussels. And it was for that reason, essentially, that I voted against the Maastricht Treaty when I was first elected to this place, and that I campaigned to leave in the last referendum, and was proud to serve as a member of the campaign committee under the chairmanship of my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath. I welcomed the subsequent commitments given by the Prime Minister in her speeches in Florence, in Lancaster House, of the red lines that the government could not breach in terms of our negotiations. And I fought the election on a manifesto which made clear that we were leaving the European Union, and that included leaving the single market and the customs union. The many benefits of leaving the European Union was summed up, as we were reminded in the drama shown on Channel 4 in Monday, which had that interesting portrayal of my right honourable friend. They were summed up in those three words: take back control. There was no doubt that one of the issues in the referendum, which did feature in my constituency, was immigration, summed up in the take back control of our borders. But I'm not opposed to immigration. I think immigration has brought great value to this country, and I understand the concerns, particularly actually of the farmers and horticulturalists that I represent in Essex, about their reliance on immigrant labour, particularly seasonal labour, and their concern that that should continue. But equally, as I think my right friend said in his contribution, they, like most farmers in the majority, voted to leave because they embrace the idea of competing in world markets and being outside the CAP, and instead of being subsidised, actually to receive payment on the basis of the contribution that they make to the public good, which is a far better system. And it is the ability for my right honourable friend to set our policy in this area in future, as it will be for every other Secretary of State, but is one of the great benefits of our regaining our freedom. It is one of the reasons why I am not attracted to the Norway option, which some have suggested, and I understand my old friend has occasionally thought about, because as we have discovered, taking evidence in the Select Committee on Exiting the European Union from parliamentarians from Norway, they actually are still bound by European regulations. And of course, freedom of movement is one of the requirements too. But it is essentially about sovereignty. It was to remove the overall jurisdiction of the ECJ. And when I went with my colleagues on the Select Committee to see Michel Barnier several times now, he was very clear that the Prime Minister's red lines did rule out the UK having membership of the EEA or an agreement similar to that which Norway has or Turkey has. He said to us the only way in which the UK can not breach its red lines and continue to have a relationship with the European Union is on the basis of an agreement like that we have signed with Canada. And he then went on to propose, and he showed us a proposal which not only was a Canada-style trade agreement, but had parallel agreements covering security, covering law and order, cooperation, covering data transfer. Indeed, he set out a scenario which was almost identical to the one which I would have described had I been asked what kind of relationship I wanted with the European Union. The only problem was that of Northern Ireland and what would happen at the Northern Ireland border. The Prime Minister accepted that that was an insuperable obstacle and therefore came out with the Chequers proposal. I could not support the Chequers proposal, principally because it maintained the common rule book, which meant that we would still have to abide by EU regulations. And it is the willingness of the government to accept further lock-ins. And I'm afraid that the amendment which is tabled by the honourable gentleman for Bassett Law does suggest that we will continue to have to accept EU regulations in the area around employment law. Yes, of course.
Gentleman for giving way. Actually, the amendment that I support with my honourable friend for Bassett Law does not say that we should automatically harmonise with the EU as they strengthen protections in these areas. What it does say that when that happens, it will come back to this House and we will debate and vote on those issues. And I think that does mean that Parliament is still taking control.
The amendment does require us to accept that all existing EU regulations in this area will be maintained. Now, I don't necessarily say that I'm in favour of removing any, although it is ironic that I recall when debating the Maastricht Treaty back in 1992, one of the arguments that were made by the then Conservative government under Sir John Major was that we had obtained an opt-out from the social chapter, that we would not be bound by the European employment and social regulations, and that that was a great prize that we had achieved. And interestingly, of course, the EU had accepted that we could be part of the what then became the European Union without being a part of the social chapter. So it always seemed to me that this indivisibility of freedoms actually is only applicable when it suits the European Union, not when it does not. Now, there are many things about the withdrawal agreement and political declaration that I do not like. I don't like the fact that we appear to be signing up to paying out £39 billion without any guarantee of a future arrangement and what it will look like. I don't like the fact that the European Court of Justice is going to continue to have a say for quite a considerable period, some 20 years ahead. I don't like the trading relationship that is described in the political declaration, which seems to be based on Chequers, with this continuing adherence to the common rule book. However, all of those aspects could be dealt with in the subsequent negotiation during the transitional period. They form part of the, with the exception of the money, which is in the withdrawal agreement, but the future arrangements can be discussed during the transitional period because they're part of a political declaration which is not legally binding. I give way to my right friend.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend agree that the money isn't £39 billion in the agreement? There's no cash limit, no agreed amount, and there are huge powers for the EU to keep sending us bills for decades in the future of an undescribed amount, and it would be a lot more than £39 billion.
I fear my right honourable friend may well be right. I mean, he highlights the risk that we run in making this commitment. But as I say, I am willing to accept an ongoing payment as long as there is an eventual exit date set out. I'm willing to accept some continuing role for the ECJ over things like citizens' rights. However, the problem is in the withdrawal agreement, because the withdrawal agreement is legally binding and cannot be changed. And I'm afraid it is, as was said by my honourable friend representing the DUP earlier, it is the backstop. It is the fact that we will be locked into a customs union without any ability to leave it unless we obtain the agreement of the European Union. That makes trade agreements essentially impossible. And one of the great opportunities from leaving the European Union is the opportunity to sign trade agreements with those countries that the European Union has been trying to sign trade agreements with for decades and has still not succeeded. China, Brazil, India, the United States of America, Indonesia, the countries that actually will be the biggest economies in the world over the course of the next 10, 20 years.
Are you aware that the EU signed a trade deal with South Korea, with Japan, with Canada, before many other nations in the world? So the EU has actually led progress on these bilateral trade deals.
Which is why I didn't include them. But the countries I did just read out are the top, likely to be the 5 biggest economies in the world. And we know that the European Union has been trying to sign a deal with China and has been trying to sign a deal with America and has failed so far to do so, principally because it does require the agreement of every single member state, and we have seen how difficult that can be. But also, of course, the provision of the backstop creates the one thing the Prime Minister said she could never accept under any circumstances, and that is a border down the Irish Sea. If Northern Ireland Protocol and the backstop could be taken out of the withdrawal agreement and put into that basket of issues which we are going to settle in the course of the transitional period as part of the arrangement covering our future agreement for trade with the European Union, that would remove the problem. It's where it ought to be. It was always daft that the Northern Ireland border issue could be determined before we knew what was going to be the future trade agreement. And the Prime Minister herself has now accepted that actually, over the course of 2 years, it should be possible to find a solution which will allow free movement back and forth across that border on the basis of technology. So the government thinks that it can be done in the next 2 years. If we could only get it out of the withdrawal agreement, we would then have the time in which we could demonstrate that it would never be necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. I did operate a hard border in Northern Ireland for 2 years. And we stopped every car, we searched every car, we checked every person. I absolutely believe it's perfectly possible for there to be free movement across that border by using new techniques and willingness on both sides, particularly things like pre-registration and number plate recognition. I think that border does not need to be hard.
Well, I'm grateful to my friend, and of course when he was serving his country in Northern Ireland, we had to have controls on the movement of people because we were facing a serious terrorist threat. Nobody is suggesting controls on movement of people now. There is no suggestion that we're going to need any kind. We're talking about the movement of goods. But as I say, and I don't want to detain the House for any longer because a lot of people want to speak, the problem is that the backstop is in the agreement and the agreement cannot be changed once it is passed because it is a legally binding undertaking. If only the government could find a way of taking it out and putting it into those issues which we will try to resolve over the course of the next 2 years, I would be happy, well not happy, but I would be willing perhaps to support the motion on Tuesday. But unless that can be done, I'm afraid that I cannot.